Hey there, everybody. If you wouldn't mind dropping a message in the chat so I can be certain that you can hear me. Hey, Will. Okay, well, please bear in mind, everybody, that there is in fact a delay between what I'm actually doing and what you're seeing on screen. So while you should feel free, absolutely free, to drop any questions or anything you'd like to go over, anything you'd like me to repeat, anything at all into the chat, please bear in mind that it's probably going to be a solid 10-15 seconds before it appears as though I've seen it. I can see your comments instantly, but even if I shifted gears, there would be about a 10 to 15 second lag. So please bear that in mind. If it doesn't seem like I'm answering you immediately, it's not because I'm being an ass. All right, so this is going to be the first of a weekly webinar series where I will spend the time going over different chunks of content from our course, from our curriculum. This one is focused on weeks 1 through 5. So that's HTML, CSS, responsive design, and Bootstrap at the upper end of that. As a result, I ask that if you have questions pertaining to JavaScript at all, don't ask them here. Okay? I want to keep this whole session on point. I want to keep it on topic, and there's more than enough to go over in CSS alone that we don't necessarily need to bring additional complexity into this for you guys to leave this webinar having learned something. Now, the direction of what we talk about, I would like to be determined by you guys. I'd like to be able to read the room. I'd like you to have either questions you have, things you'd like to see, things you'd like to go over. I will now and always have stuff in my back pocket which I can pull out and try to introduce so that I can teach something new within old parameters. You know, everyone thinks that they're done with HTML and CSS after week 6. The reality is that's not even close to true. So there will always be new stuff to teach, but I would like the course of the discussion to be determined by you guys. So, how's everybody feeling? One thing which I thought I might break out to talk about in the early stages is how to achieve that slanted effect that we see in the Unica theme, which is, or at least used to be, so popular with Codify students. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and pull it up for a second. Feel free to interrupt me, though, if there is something else on your mind. Also, please bear in mind that unless your YouTube handle is very, very obviously your name, I have no idea who you are. So, Long Island Firecracker, no clue who you are. Alright, so this is the Unica theme here, and as you can see, there are quite a few of these slanted lines separating the sections. And while I personally hate them, I detest them, they make me so mad, but a lot of students really love them, and love them or hate them, it's definitely useful to know how to create them. So I thought that's something that we could dive into. There are multiple ways to approach it. Hi, Tanisha. How you doing? There are multiple ways to accomplish this using CSS that you probably have not seen a lot of. So that's something I thought we might dive into a little bit, unless we get directed elsewhere. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started pushing in that direction. And first thing I'm going to do is, of course, create a div. As you can see, I'm working with a bare bones template here. We have no Bootstrap, no plugins, no libraries, nothing. No JavaScript as well. So we're keeping this as bare bones as possible. I'm going to give my div an ID of container, so we know exactly and clearly what we're talking about. And I'll put some text inside of it. Nothing crazy, but now is when I'm going to jump into CSS, select my div with a class of with an ID of container. I'm going to give it a background color of tomato. I'm going to center all of its content. I'm going to make all of the text inside of it white. I'm going to give it a nice thick padding. Okay. Now, there is that white space around my container, which I probably don't want. And I find that a lot of students run into this issue in the very, very beginning. Before I fix it, I want to show you how I would figure out how to fix it. As always, I'd suggest using your inspector. Open up your inspector. Click this little button here, which allows you to highlight elements on your page and try to figure out where that white space is coming from. I'm having actually a really hard time figuring out where it's coming from here. I keep jumping from div with the ID of container to the HTML element. But let's jump into our Elements tab down here and select my body. And if I hover over it, I can see that my body has this orange line running all around it, and that's what's causing all that white space. That's what's eating up the white space. If you look over on the right in Styles, there's very little CSS on the body, but there is a little bit applied by default by what's called the user agent style sheet. It's built into your browser. So these are the styles which are added by default to our body element, and one of them is a margin of 8 pixels. So I'm going to experiment here in my inspector. I'm going to try to apply a margin of 0 to my body, and look at that, the white space disappears. So now that I know that that works, I'm going to jump into my CSS and add it here. Reload, and we're good. No more white space. All right. I will, however, give my body a padding top of something like 150 pixels so it pushes our container downward, just so it's not flush against the top of the screen. All right, so how do we achieve that slanted effect from the Unica theme? Well, let's think about it. Does anybody have any guesses off the top of their head? I'm going to just talk out loud for a little bit and try to approximate what the thought process for this should be. So what could we do? We could probably arrange for like an image that is actually a slanted bit of tomato colored color, but that's a really inefficient way of doing it. Who is that who said layering? Because I'm not going to try to pronounce your handle. There's a very slim chance I will pronounce it correctly. In the meantime, though... Oh, hey, Mario. Hey, Mario. So Will, you said top border radius. That with Mario, that is the most unexpected handle for you I'd have ever thought. Okay, so Will, you said border top radius. Well, let's try it. I'm going to come into my container selector and apply border top. Wait, border. Well, shoot, what is it? Border top radius? Border top right and left radius is what I have to do. I can't do them both at the same time. And let's just try something like 20 pixels. I'll just do right for now, see what happens. Well, that made that curved the very rightmost, top rightmost corner of my container just a little bit. Let's see what happens if I increase this to, say, 200. Well, that's definitely doing something. It's definitely having an effect. Let's try in our inspector. If I keep going with this, it does keep pushing that corner inward. It's reasonable to think that this might actually get us there. Let me try 20,000 pixels. But at 20,000 pixels, it looks like it's maxed out. This is as far as something like border top right radius will take that corner. It rounded it. This is a cool effect. You could definitely use this nicely, but this is not what we're going for. What if I tried something like percentages? 50%. It's a little different. Notice that it is a very different curve. What about 100%? Oh, that's nice. 150%. 350%. Okay, so it's maxed out there. It's maxed out at this 100%. Percentage isn't going to get us there. Although this is also a really nice effect. I like this a lot. So border radius is unfortunately not going to do the job for us. So I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. As I said, there are multiple ways to accomplish this. So one way, probably the easiest way, is to use what are called pseudo elements. Pseudo elements. You probably have not ever had to use pseudo elements before, although you have definitely seen them if you've been through even the first week of the course. And what pseudo elements are I like to think of them as ghosts of elements that we have created, which the browser also creates. We don't create them at all. We don't create the pseudo elements at all. We create the element. We created this div. But this div has the capacity to have two pseudo elements, two shadow elements, or two ghost elements that are basically copies of itself. And these are created automatically by the browser. Rarely will we use them, and they would never have a serious effect on a website's layout, or that at least they shouldn't. If they do, you're doing it wrong. But they can be used to great effect for achieving cool styles, or little animations, or nice little effects that might be outside the fold. So the pseudo elements are there, but they're currently not doing anything. So in order to access the pseudo elements, we're really just going to style them in CSS. So I'll start by selecting the element with the ID of container, and then I will add to that selector : after. And this is specifically selecting the after pseudo element of the element with the ID of container. Once I have it selected, I can do anything I want with it. Anything at all. So, first thing I want to do with pseudo elements is I want to give it the content of an empty set of quotes. They can be double quotes, they can be single quotes, doesn't matter. Okay, the content of empty quotes. This is the only use case, pretty much, for the content CSS property. And what this does is it establishes that the after pseudo element is going to be used. It should be there, it should have a purpose, but it is going to be empty of text. That's all it does. It just makes it ready to be used. And once it is ready to be used, we can say, give it a background color. I'm going to give it a different background color than container, just so we can see it. And I'll give it a height. And I'll give it a width, just to make sure we can see it for now. And let's see. Nothing yet. But if I jump into my inspector, you see that double semicolon after right there? That's our after pseudo element, believe it or not. Our CSS is working on it, but we're still not seeing it. We're still not seeing it. Okay, but we'll get there. Now, what do I want to do with the after pseudo element? Let's take this one step at a time. I'm going to select my element with the ID of container and give it position relative. Position relative is not going to do anything to container. It's not going to move it. It's not going to change it. It's not going to have any effect whatsoever. But it will allow me to give position absolute to the after pseudo element, the child of container. And now we can see it. Now we can see our after pseudo element. It's not in the right place. It's not doing anything correctly, but we can actually see it, which is great. We're getting that much closer. So with it positioned absolutely, I can now force it to be positioned wherever I want inside container. So I'm going to make sure it's all the way on the left, and I'm going to make sure it's all the way on the bottom. There's our purple after. Now what do I want to do with it? Good question. I want to use this after pseudo element to achieve that slant, or at least the bottom slant in this case. So, how do I use something like this to achieve that slant? What do I have to do to this purple bar in order to achieve that slant? Any thoughts? No thoughts. We are devoid of thoughts. This doesn't need to be technical. You can just give me an answer like turn it a little. Any kind of thought at all. Some kind of animation. That's sure. Pardon me, guys. Some kind of animation. That's not a bad answer, but I'd like something a little more specific. What kind of animation, for example? So percentage from left. So if I tried something like left 10%, it's going to move it over a little bit. Not really what we're after, but good thought. I'm going to change the height of this guy to 50%. So it's now half the height of its parent. And I don't want it to be inside container. I actually want it to be below container. So I'm going to give it a bottom of minus 50%. Okay? It's got a height of 50%, and it is now 50% below the bottom border of container. So now it's Adrian, change the position based off its parent. Well, we're already doing that with left and bottom. But again, we want this to create that slant, that slanted line, that angle. Changing its position, I mean, it's just going to be like moving a brick. It's still going to be horizontally positioned like this. It's still going to be straight horizontal lines. Is there a way to turn an element, for example? And this is, I'd argue, one of the most important properties for advanced CSS that you guys could ever need. There's one property that governs a lot of things that are really, really useful for some advanced CSS. Animation effect is all I can think of. Something to do with polygons. You could use polygons. I'm going to stay away from stuff like SVGs and polygons because those are not universally supported across browsers, and I'm not trying to get too complex with here. So Adrian, 2D transform. You are definitely on the right track. It's just the transform property. I'm going to do transform. I'm going to do rotate. And I'm going to choose to rotate it. Let's try 15 degrees. Almost. It's not bad, right? We're getting there. But that's too much, isn't it? About 5 degrees. Better. Definitely better. Let me try and bring that up now. Here, I'll jump into my inspector. Let's try and bring this up just a little bit. %. Let's see, does that work? Nope. Eventually it uncovers a bit of itself again. Let's keep going. 30%. 30% looks pretty good. That about covers it. 30%. Bottom 30%. Only problem now is it's not actually reaching the edge of the page, right? Down here, there's a little bit of white between the corner of that purple block and the edge of our page. And that makes sense because we turned it. So how are we going to fix that? What if we make it wider? What happens if I increase its width? Let's do 105, 105%. Well, now it's always going to reach the edge of the page. That looks good. So I'm going to do that. 105%. Is there any problem with this? Excuse me. Is there any problem with this as is? Other than the fact that we got to change the color, obviously, but that's the easy part. The only problem that I can see is I can now scroll to the right. I can scroll to the right and see where all this stuff is reaching off of my page, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. The z-index, you mean the fact that it's on top? That's true. We could use z-index to push it behind. In fact, why don't we do that? I'll give it a z-index of -1. There we go. That's fine. Quick, easy fix. Good observation. But I don't like that we can scroll to the right here and see all this messiness. So what can I do to fix that? Before you answer, consider that if I inspect and we take a look at our elements, that after pseudo element is actually inside the div with the ID of container. It's considered to be inside the div with the ID of container. So the hopefully obvious solution is, there you go, select the element with the ID of container and give it an overflow property of not hidden, but hidden. And now, oh, now it's gone. My fault. Great, this is a good teaching moment. Overflow hidden, it hides all of the purple div now, essentially, or the purple after element. If I take away the z-index, this is all that's left that we can see. So I'm actually really glad I made this mistake. The correct approach to this is not to set overflow to hidden, but overflow X. That's not right. All right. That will not work. The solution is to apply overflow hidden to the body element. There we go. And now we can no longer scroll. So Ismail, the width of the container is naturally 100% because I haven't changed it at all. So it does have a width of 100%. The only reason why the after element is even allowed to extend outside of that 100% is because it is positioned absolutely, and I have given it a width of 105%. However, because of its position, this width of more than 100% does not impact the width of its parent. So as far as the body is concerned, in other words, the body is 100% the width of my window. And what it contains is one element, which is 100% the width of the body. Everything else, everything in this absolutely positioned element is extra. It's just extra, which is very easily covered. So let me push that purple element behind again. Change the background color to tomato to match its parent. And we have a slant. Very, 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 very good observation. Okay, that's something I'll go over right now, actually. Let's get rid of this container element. This after element, pardon me. Okay, no after element here at all. No after element whatsoever. And the latest suggestion is on the container element, apply transform, skew, and I'm just going to try 5 degrees. Okay, that doesn't quite work, but 0, 5 degrees does kind of work. What do we notice about that, though? What's happened to the content of the div? It has also skewed, right? So let's say that this is what we are going for. This works, this is okay. One way we could handle this effect is to select everything inside, every direct child of the container. Every direct child of the container. Remember that asterisk is a selector for anything. And not set the transform of these guys to initial. We actually have to counteract that 5 degrees of the skew on the parent. And now it's perfectly fine. I personally find this method a little bit verbose, though, even though it's actually less code. The safer way, which I would approach this particular strategy, is let's bring back our after element. Actually, let me copy it. Make a copy of it. Position absolute, good. Left, good. Let's change this to top 0. Content, good. Z index, that's fine. Background color, let me set it back to purple so we can see. I'm going to change height to 100%, width to 100%, and get rid of that transform entirely. Okay, so far, not a whole lot has changed. But to achieve the same effect without having to deal with what's going on in the middle here, let's move this transform skew from the parent container to the after pseudo element. Okay? Only problem here is it's too short. See how it's hitting the middle of the top and bottom planes? So we might have to increase the height of this guy to get the same effect. let's go for something like that. What is that? 100. Let's go 120% height and top minus 10%. And that looks like it does it. Oh. Nope. Not quite. Let's bring it out to a wide screen and try again. Let's do minus 20% and a height of 140. That'll work. Height 140%, top minus 20%, background color tomato. There you go. That works. So great suggestion, Farida. Now the only issue, or the only follow-up question that I have here is, what if I want this bottom line to skew this way, but this top line to skew the opposite way? Like, both of these lines are now parallel, which is nice. That's cool. That's what Unica does. But if I want them to come together, if you know what I mean, how would I do that? Well, to do that, we're not going to use any transform, or rather, we're not going to use any transform on the parent. We're going to go back to where we were before with our single after element. Ooh, it's a nice thought. But I'm going to copy everything for our after element, and I'm going to change one of them to before. And the only difference we need to do here is change bottom to top and rotate from 5 degrees to minus 5 degrees. And now they're coming together. Let me push it down a little bit more so we can see. There we go. Any questions about that? This is advanced CSS stuff, guys. This is advanced manipulation of shapes. The key takeaway is, one, that there is in fact a transform property out there, and it's worth all of your guys' time to, as you get into exploring more complex stylings or animations, you should explore that property. That property is hugely useful. I really do think it's the most important property that you could need. Adrian, since there is no maximum screen size, how do you keep responsive design when there are screen sizes larger than what you are building on? Well, you test. I mean, if I really wanted to, I could just zoom out. So eventually, you're right, we do run into a problem here. But this is at 33% of my current screen size. So let's see. I'm currently at a width of 900 pixels. So this represents what my screen will look at a width of 2700 pixels wide. Now, personally, I'm not going to take the time to design for anybody who has a desktop that wide, a desktop monitor that wide, because that's atrociously wide. Somebody out there probably does. But realistically, if they have a screen that wide, they're not going to be looking at my website at full screen size. Does that make sense? Like, this is not a demographic that I find it worthwhile to spend time on. And to achieve this, to actually check, all I did was hit Control minus. Say I'm at 33% screen size. 33% at 900 pixels tells you that this is what my screen is going to look like at 2700, or 900 times 3. So back to normal screen size. It's a good question, but like I say in week 4, you know, there are always going to be screen sizes, or there are always going to be browsers that are going to cause problems with your styling. That doesn't mean that you should take the time to fix those problems, because, you know, like I tend to say in my classes, there's always going to be some jerk out there who really wants to look at your site like this. And that's not someone you should ever code for. Okay? It's not someone you should ever try to make your site fully responsive for. I'm going to change this overflow on my body to overflow X, just so that we can continue to scroll down as we make more stuff. But hopefully this was, you know, a neat little thing for you guys to walk away with. The transform property is a good one to know. The even larger takeaway, and the one that I think is more relevant to what you guys, where you guys are right now, is the relationship of position relative as a parent with two absolutely positioned children. I applied position relative on the element with the ID of container, which doesn't cause it to move at all. Doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything to container. All it does is it redefines the boundaries of left, top, bottom, and right for any children it has which are positioned absolutely. So to put that another way, let me go ahead and clear out all of my code, or at least all of this. And we're just going to go back to a regular container, which is positioned relatively. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put another child inside, I'll give it an ID of child even, inside container. Doesn't have any text, doesn't have any content, it's just a div with an ID of child. So I'm going to select it. The element with the ID of container, which has a child with the ID of child, that's what we're selecting. And I'm going to give it a height of 150 pixels, a width of, sorry, it's hard to type around my microphone, 150 pixels, background color of purple, and that's it. Okay, and there's child. It's a nondescript square. But now I'm going to make child position absolute. Immediately it has gone invisible. Okay, the other elements pretend like it's not even there. It is there, we can see it, but the other elements pretend that it's not. If I take off position relative on the parent and then apply something like top 0 to child, that's where it goes. This is the position where top is 0 for my child when container is not position relative. If I do right 0, you should know where it's going to go. If I change it to left 0, all the way to the top left corner. If I change top to bottom, all the way to the bottom left corner. Okay? But the second that I apply position relative to the parent element, container, which contains child, that changes the point of reference for child when moving to the position of bottom 0, left 0. Okay, so once again, what we're seeing here is without position relative on container, and when I reload, we're going to see it with position relative on container. See the difference? So now top 0 and right 0 are not going to move it to the top right corner of the screen. They're going to move it to the top right corner of container. Okay, so if I wanted to make some kind of interesting overlap, maybe this purple box is where I'd put a testimonial or something. I could do something like bottom minus, what's half of 350? 175 minus 175 pixels. And right, let's do something like 40 pixels. Not loving it, but you get the idea. Now I've got this nice little overlap, and I could put something cool in that box. It's not fully inside its parent, it's not fully outside its parent, but it is going to stay in its current position relative to its parent, no matter how I resize my window. Does that make sense? So you could make container's position relative to another parent div instead of the body. I don't understand. Try again. I could make container's position relative to another parent div instead. Yeah, yes, I think I understand you correctly. So if I, for instance, I mean, I wouldn't need to because it's just sitting in the body, but let's say there was a div with an ID of outer container, because why not? Okay, and guys, notice how I just took the time to actually indent my stuff there. We can talk about Flexbox. Do I want to talk about Flexbox? I may talk about Flexbox. Notice how I took a moment to actually indent my stuff here, guys. I still see a lot of students writing all of their code, all of their elements on the same vertical line. It doesn't take long. You can indent multiple lines at a time by highlighting them in Sublime and hitting Tab. If you want to pull them back a space, you press Shift Tab, Shift Tab, 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 Shift Tab, Tab, Shift Tab, Tab, Shift Tab. It doesn't take much, but it is terrible practice to not indent your stuff. So if you still find that every time you go inside of an element you are not indenting your HTML, get a ruler and whack yourself on the knuckles with it, because there's no excuse for that, seriously. So like for instance a div inside a div inside a div, and each div is positioned to its parent. Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. How do I want to do this? Rather than outer container, I'll delete that. Let's put some divs inside of child. How about that? Div with an ID of grandchild. And inside of grandchild will be a div with an ID of great-grandchild. Back into CSS. Now, container, child, grandchild. We'll make them all squares. Position, absolute. And I'm going to select both grandchild and great-grandchild on this same line. Holy shit, go away. Jesus Christ. Hold on a second. Okay, so both grandchild and great-grandchild are now positioned absolute. I am going to make great-grandchild smaller and a different color. Blue, height 50 pixels, width 50 pixels. Okay, so we have boxes within boxes now. So Adrian, it sounds like your question is, can I apply the same principle to these great-grandchildren? Or rather, is the green box positioned relative to the purple box? And is the blue box positioned relative to the green box? And the answer is yes. I don't need to reuse position relative. Position it still applies. It still applies. So let me put great-grandchild. No, let me put grandchild in the bottom left and great-grandchild in the top right. Oh, great-grandchild did not move top right. Oh, because now these lefts, it now also has a left. Let me just get rid of that. I'm making my life too complicated here. There we go. Okay, so now you can see top, right, left, bottom, all of these are still working the way you would expect relative to their immediate parent. So that can be really, really useful. And frankly, if I were using, say, percentages, like let's make grandchild 50% the width and 50% the height of its parent. It's still going to be a square because its parent is a perfect square. And then let's position great-grandchild at minus 100%, minus 100% is going to put it in the top right corner of its great-grandparent. So there's a lot of things you can do with this interplay between position relative and position absolute to really nail down a layout that you're going for, a complicated layout. A lot of people turn to things like CSS Grid or Flexbox to achieve similar effects, and they're great tools for it, but they are in no way necessary. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. All right, what's next? Any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to dial it back some for anybody who's still in the early weeks and for whom this might feel over their head. Only thing I want to close out here with, I'm going to undo everything. Okay, we're back to our before and after elements. Let me undo what I did here. Okay, we're back to this dealio. What I did here, I have 3 different selectors, and each of them has a background color of tomato, right? That's totally fine. It's all the same color. But if I wanted to change the color somehow, if I say I don't want it to be tomato anymore, I want it to be crimson. Well, now I have to change it in 3 different places, and that's potentially kind of annoying. 3 times is not a whole lot, but as your web apps get bigger, it may be 10 places, maybe 12 places. And what most people use in a situation like that is something like SCSS, SAS, more complicated superscript of CSS. But it's not necessary for little things like this. If I want to make this more efficient, then rather set the background color of my before and after pseudo elements to tomato, I can instead set them to a value of inherit. And now they are going to inherit the color of their parent. So I only need to change it now in 1 place. Oh, good Lord. Okay, so inherit, like initial, is another one of those really useful universal property values in CSS. Definitely something to think about looking into. All right, well, if nobody else has any questions on this stuff, I thought maybe we would just try some hover effects on for size next. Some hover effects and some styling of buttons. and some interesting selectors. Okay, I'm going to make 4 different buttons in my HTML. There are my 4 buttons. Before I do anything with them, I want to style them. So I could select all of my button elements with an element selector like this, right? And I could say, give it a background color of tomato, text color of white, text transform uppercase, border 1 pixel solid, also tomato, or border none. And now I want to make it fatter. What I see a lot of students do here is do something like width 150 pixels, height 50 pixels, and that's okay. That works. That definitely does work, except eventually your buttons start to get kind of weird. What I find is more useful for styling buttons rather than width or height is simply padding. Just use padding to create distance between the text content of the button and the borders of the button. There's no right or wrong way. That's just a personal preference, really. Let me do 40 here. Personal preference, but I find that this is just a cleaner way of styling buttons, unless you really need them to be just so. Like if you want a button to be 100% of the width of its container. Okay, now what would I do if I didn't want all of these buttons on the same line? I see this throw a lot of people off. Hey, Tony. So what could I do to get all of these buttons on a different line, other than wrap each one of them in a div? Yes. Okay, I could make them display block. So I ask you, what are buttons naturally by default? What is their display property? We'll also give them a margin to space them out a little bit. Inline, so we have a vote for inline. Let's examine one. Here we go. According to the user agent style sheet, buttons are not inline elements. They are inline block elements. You want to know how I know that? Other than the fact that I can, look. If I turn off display, inline block, the user agent style sheet, which we already discussed is what assigns those default styles, tells me that buttons are display inline block elements. Okay? Let's try changing this block to inline. You don't see any change. Don't see any change. But I'm going to take off that padding now and go back to width. No change, right? The reason that I know that they're inline block as opposed to inline, is because of how they actually behave around other elements. There are limits to how inline elements can be styled. Margin is very, very tricky with inline elements. It usually doesn't work. In many cases, even something like width will not work with inline elements. Buttons are naturally inline block because we can style them however we want, except they will allow other elements onto the same line with them. Another way is, you see the white space in between each of these buttons? You don't get that with inline. that white space is coming from these line breaks in my HTML. Inline elements, completely disregard that. An example of an inline element would be, say, an input. Can you guys think of another example of an inline block element, an element that is naturally inline block? Bueller. No. A div is most definitively a block element. Divs are always block elements. Divs, sections. Yeah. Figuring out that you need to comment out the white space if you want inline block elements to be just so. That's a really annoying problem to have to solve. There are other ways to solve it, but I find that to be the cleanest one. Anyway, a very common inline block element that we use all the time is an image. An image element is an inline block element. Okay? It's not important that you guys memorize these kinds of things, but you should, yeah. Yeah, here, let me show you. Holy crap, I can't type today. There's our image. Inspect it. User agent style sheet doesn't actually tell us anything. But yes, images are naturally inline block elements. That's weird. I'm actually very surprised that it's not listed here. But knowing that is... Yeah, knowing that images are inline block element can potentially help you understand why they behave the way that they do in certain situations. Just like understanding that a button is naturally an inline block element can help you determine how to, say, put them all on their own line by simply making them display block, rather than what a lot of people will do, which is wrap them in their own div. And the reason why that works is because divs are block elements. Anyway, now that we have our buttons, let's make them each a different color. How can I make them each a different color without giving any of these buttons classes or IDs? Yeah, CSS can be fun. I love it. But how can what CSS selectors can we use to make each of our buttons a different color without using classes or IDs? Again, guys, if this feels like totally over your head and you just have a much more simple question or something about the Apple replica or anything like that, please do not be afraid to shout out. Everyone who's talking now are much more advanced students, and I'm going over some advanced stuff, but this session is primarily for you, so there's no such thing as a dumb question. This is the time to ask a dumb question if you've managed to find a dumb question. And please take advantage. I'm here for you. That sounds like you need to practice CSS more then. So how can I select these buttons without using classes or IDs or JavaScript? Does anybody know? All right, well, what I'm looking for is nth child. The nth child selector allows you to select whatever this is, whatever comes before nth child, in this case a button, which is the nth child of its parent. In this case, the second child. See how I put that 2 in there? This selects a button which is the second child of its parent. I want to drive that home. This doesn't select the second button on your page. It selects a button which is the second child of its parent. Okay? That is an important distinction. So if I select button nth child 2 and give it a background color of red, our second button is actually red. Our second button is red. Now watch what happens if I add like an H1 up here. Now look at which button is red. It's our first button. Our first button is now red because our first button is now the second child of its parent. The H1 is the first child. The button is the second child. Okay, that's an important, very important distinction that a lot of people have trouble with when dealing with nth child. The nth child selector selects the element which is this child of its parent element. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that H1 now. And we're going to make each of our buttons a different color using this nth child selector. Nth child 3, nth child 4. There. 4 differently colored buttons. I'm going to change border to none. A little better. Yeah, the nth child selector is fun. There are a lot of selectors in CSS that I guarantee you guys don't know, and can be very helpful, especially in conjunction with JavaScript. But that'll be something for a later session. All right, so now that we have each of our buttons selected distinctly like this, even though we're not using any CSS, any class or ID selectors, let's create some hover effects on them. Okay, so a simple one, I'll just apply this to the first button. Let's make it go from tomato background to a dark red background. All right, so this is the first button on my page, correct? Yeah, Adrian, that's a very good point. It doesn't future-proof stuff, but if I wanted to use nth child in a future-proof fashion, then reliably what I would do is put all of these divs in an ID, all of these buttons in a div with an ID of something like buttons. And then it would be considerably more future-proof because all of these buttons are still the appropriately numbered children of this div. But yes, you're right. You can really screw things up easily. There are other ways to use nth child, or nth rather, as a CSS selector. You know, I'm not sure this is worth showing you right now, but there's also nth of type. Let's try 2. And that changed the color of that button. Didn't override the background, though. There we go. Nth of type 2, but I can do more with nth of type. I just put a static number in there, 2. But if I put, say, 2n, what is that going to do? Well, now it makes every other button have no background and black text. So that can be really useful for, say, list items, or a to-do list, or a comment app if you want to make every other comment a different color. Things like that can be really useful. Of course, you can also do 3n, 4n, 5n, whatever iteration you want. But that's much more specialized. Anyway, back to where we were. I set a hover effect on the very first button, which changes the background color from tomato to dark red. So let's see if that works. It does. Only problem is it very much clips in. It just immediately goes from tomato to dark red. So how could I make that transition a little more appealing? Transition effect on the hover selector. Okay, let's try it. Transition, I'll give it a nice long one. 1 second ease. Close, Tony. Reverse the order there, and you'll be good. All right, so, okay, yes, it hovers in, but it clips out. Okay, I hope you understand what I mean when I say clips. When I say clips, I mean it jumps instantaneously from one color to the next. It doesn't have this nice fade in, which it does when I hover over. Can you think of why it's only working in one direction now? And I'm very glad that we got here organically. Well, the answer is this fade effect, the actual animation from tomato to dark red, is made possible, no, Tony, is made possible by this transition property. But this transition property, exactly, this transition property, good job, Will, it is only applied on hover. So when I hover over it, it has a transition property, and it transitions from tomato to dark red. As soon as I move my mouse off, that transition property no longer exists as far as the button is concerned. So I don't ever want to put transition inside a selector that uses a hover state. I want to apply it to the vanilla element selector, the original element selector. How about setting transition also in the normal selector without the hover? Not also, but instead. If I set it in the normal selector, it will now fade a full second in both directions. Now what you could do by inserting an additional transition property in the hover selector is change the speed with which it hovers in. Let's say we want it to hover, to change color to dark red twice as fast. But then it takes 1 second, let's change this to 1.5 seconds, to fade back out. Well, now this will be how it fades in. This will be how it fades out. In, slow out. Fast in, slow out. Fast in, slow out. So that is a way that you could use a transition effect inside a hover selector. But if you want it to have any kind of transition in both directions, you need to be sure to have that transition property on the vanilla selector. All right, so that's one button. Simple enough. How about we add a shadow to this? You know, some buttons, they throw a shadow when you hover over them. What property can I use for that? Box shadow. Good. And the way box shadow works is it takes up to 4 values. It takes the number of pixels which you want to push the shadow along the x-axis. It takes the number of pixels which you want to push the shadow along the y-axis. It takes the number of pixels with which you want to blur your shadow, and it takes the color of your shadow. 4 values there. That's a really dark shadow. That's too dark. That's better. It's not the most attractive button, but it now throws a shadow on hover. Personally, I think it's too far out along the x-axis, so I'm going to bring that in. Yeah, that's true. Generators like that are definitely a good way to go. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But let's try this the opposite way. Which I mean to say, I'm going to change my box shadow now to 0 pixels along the x, and an even 5 pixels along the y. Everything else I will keep the same. Okay, so it's a very slight shadow, but it's there. Let me zoom in. Slight shadow, but it's there. But what if I wanted to make this button actually feel like a button, where when you hover over it, it looks like you're depressing the button. You're actually pressing the button down. It's kind of weird that the shadow is getting sucked up into the button. So I want to make it feel like an actual button, which means first I'm going to apply this box shadow to the regular selector. Inset. Good thought. You can do a lot with inset, but that's not exactly what I'm going for. I'm going to apply the box shadow to the regular selector, and then I'm going to add box shadow to the hover selector of 0, 0, 0, and the color can stay the same because it doesn't matter. So now when I hover over the button, the shadow disappears. That's cool. That's a start. It's kind of what I'm going for. Let me simplify what we're looking at here. But it still doesn't really feel like a button. Instead, it feels like a box whose shadow disappears. Right? Oh, that's a nice thought. Change the actual size on hover. That could work. But rather than changing the size on hover, I actually want to move it on hover. So it actually appears as though the button is being depressed when you hover over it. So let's use that transform property again. And in this case, rather than rotate or skew or anything like that, I just want to move the button up, say 10 pixels. No, 5 pixels. Let's do 5 pixels. Transform can take a value like translate y, and I want to move it 5 pixels up, so minus 5 pixels. If I do that, all the buttons have now moved up 5 pixels. All the buttons have now moved up 5 pixels. But if I want it to appear to move back to its original position on hover, then when I hover, I'm going to translate y to 0. Let's reload. And look at that. I have a button which depresses now. It both drops that 5 pixels as though we are pressing down on it, and that box shadow disappears as though we are pressing down on it. So now we have a button effect that looks like we're actually depressing it and getting ready to press on it, or click it, or do whatever you do to buttons. Does that make sense? This is a really useful effect for, you know, some nice UI effects. They go a long way. Simple, but they can potentially do a lot. Now that we have an effect like this, let's talk about how we might want to structure our CSS if we wanted to use this effect all over the place. Like if we're building a really complicated site or a big app that has a lot of buttons or a lot of UI elements which we want to use this effect. If we want to use it all over the place, we probably don't want to have to write this stuff all over again, right? So instead, a much more appropriate way to handle it, much more best practice as far as CSS is concerned, would be to create a custom class for it. I'm going to call it depress BTN, depress button. And depress button is going to have the important ones here. Let's go with box shadow, transition, and transform. And then we're also going to have depress button hover. And depress button hover is going to have all 3 of these. So now, if I want to engage this effect with any particular UI element or any particular element on my page, all I need to do is add to it the class of depress-btn, depress button. I've created for myself a utility class, just like a bootstrap class, which we can now reuse over and over again, and it helps keep our CSS that much more efficient. Okay, so I deleted it from all the buttons, and now I'm just going to add this class, depress button, to that first button element. And it works. That's all I have to do now. If I just want the first one and the fourth one, now they both have it. Does that make sense? Alright, well, let's talk about some other button effects. Yeah. You guys should never shy away from trying to modularize your CSS into utility classes like this. Like, for example, as you might expect in a lot of my sites, I have a bg-tomato class. Guess what that does? One thing, but it saves me a lot of time when rather than have to apply the same background color to a dozen different elements on the page, I can just add this class to an HTML element as I write. Adrian, stupid question time. Can you contain multiple selectors like button and button hover inside of a class? I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Is it like, can I apply multiple hover effects to a single class? Or could I apply, say, a hover effect to all my buttons and a hover effect to depress button and have them both work on a button which has the class of depress button? Can you contain multiple selectors like button and button hover inside of a class? Well, assuming I'm understanding your question correctly, you absolutely can. So let's say I add a hover effect to all my buttons, which gets rid of the background completely and gives them a thin border. And just like that. Okay, so now we have two hover effects. One hover effects for buttons, one hover effects for elements with the class of depress button, and I have two button elements which have the class of depress button. Are both of these hover effects going to work on it? The answer is yes, although that background is not being overridden. I'm just going to cheat here for a second. There. There. See, now both hover effects are working on the same elements. Like make one class called .depressButton, and inside it have many different selectors such as button, button hover, button active. You can't have selectors inside of selectors in CSS, not unless you're using a compiler like Sass, and that is definitely outside the scope of this session here. But different one class called depressButton, and inside it have many different selectors. I mean, something that I could do is like .depressButton hover anchor. Forget how to write strike through. Maybe it's transform. All right, well, anyway, strike through. I'll go with lowercase. Doesn't matter. This kind of selector would mean when I hover over elements with the class of depressButton, anchors which are inside of that element will obtain this CSS. So there's lots of ways you can complicate a hover selector if that's what you're going for. William, I think developing our own personal libraries as we go along is very good practice in streamlining. That's definitely true. Definitely true. I'm in full support of that. And again, not just CSS libraries. Don't just record CSS properties and classes that you're fond of, but do the same for JavaScript functions. You should have your own personal sheet of universal functions. You should have a function for capitalizing any string whenever you need to, or generating a random number without having to go through all the math.random crap. But again, we're focused on CSS today. So we now have that depress button effect. What else can we do with our buttons? Well, let's make a new utility class and call this one capsule button. And let's do capsule button, which will have a border radius of 0. And then capsule button hover will have a border radius of 50 pixels. And I will add the same transition effect to capsule button, and we're going to give capsule button class to our second button. And when I hover over it, it turns into a little pill shape. What if we wanted it to actually look like a pill? I mean, if for some reason we were working on a UI for some kind of medical or health tech application, is there a way to actually make this element look like a pill? It's a pretty simple effect, but it's the kind of thing that might stop you just because you don't inherently know how to do it. And I don't want you to refrain from doing so just because you can't think off the top of your head of how to accomplish that effect. Anybody? Well, I think it was you, Tony, who said this, or no, Adrian. You said inset before, and there is such thing as an inset box shadow. So why don't we try to take advantage of that? First, let's experiment with the button in our Styles tab and see if we can approximate the effect that we're going for. And this is going to be box shadow, inset, and then I always get confused when using inset box shadows. It takes some experimenting, but let's try 50 pixels, 0, 0, 0, and crimson without that hashtag. Okay, so that's that inset box shadow. Not exactly what I was going for. What if I change this to 50%? Nope, that doesn't work. So let's try 150 pixels. Too much. Bring it down. About halfway. 75 pixels. That works for me. Let's change the crimson to something like light red. Evidently that's not a color. Okay, I'll use the color picker. So we'll just go with a blue. Something very markedly different. Something like that. Now, is there going to be a problem with this? When I hover, we get that circular effect, but maybe we can actually work with that. Let's bring this down back to 50 pixels. I mean, that's something. We could try to work with that, make that work. But inset box shadow, it is appropriating the border radius of its element, and that's not necessarily something that we want. I mean, this is actually kind of interesting because it looks like a pill in perspective. So if that's something you're going for and you're going to make that work, we could do that. Let's add that to our capsule button hover effect, and there you go. Button to pill. But there's probably a better way to handle this. There's probably a better way to handle this because I just want to see a straight line straight down the middle. An inset box shadow, it looks like that's not going to handle that for me. So why don't we come back and revisit our pseudo elements. I'm going to make capsule button position relative. I'm going to make capsule button after position absolute. It's going to have a width of exactly 50%, a height of 100%. Oh, that's right, it's going to have a content of nothing, empty string. And it's going to be positioned at top 0, left 0, and a background color of this light lilac. Okay, that works so far. We don't want it on top of our text though, do we? And that's too far. It actually puts it behind our text. So we can't use z-index in this case unless we wanted to insert our text in its own element and give it also a z-index. But I don't want to go through all that trouble. So instead, what we could do is use a mix blend mode. yet another cool CSS effect that I imagine a lot of you have not experimented with. Let's do color. That's actually perfect. Mix blend mode color. This is the perfect attribute, perfect property for what I want right now. But you can see there are a lot that you could experiment with. These do some pretty wonderful things to images. And they're definitely fun to play around with. Alright, so with that we can now see our text, we can see our after, but we don't want it to be visible at all times, and we definitely don't want it to be poking out the corners of our button like that. So let's give capsule button the overflow property set to hidden. Let's see if that takes care of, there we go. Now we've got our pill shape, but I only want the after element visible when you hover. So I'm going to give my after element an opacity of 0. And then we're going to create one final class, capsule button hover after. And we are going to set its opacity from 0 to 1. Oop, that's right. Damn. There we go. There we go. Now the only thing that's missing is the transition, right? So let's copy that transition property and apply that to our after element. So, from a regular button to a medical capsule. It's a strange choice of effect, but you get the idea. Nevertheless, we were able to achieve it by being creative with the CSS properties that are given to us. Mix blend mode is probably entirely new. Inset is entirely new, but we didn't even use that one. But with the exception of that mix blend mode, we're using familiar properties in unfamiliar ways. And I want you guys to start trying to do that on your own. There's nothing to stop you from doing so. Yeah, there's a weird effect. I don't love it. Let's go to that third button now. And let's make this one not just have a hover effect, but let's actually make it animate in some fashion. I'll make the text inside it animate. And to do this, first thing I'm going to want to do is put the text inside it in a span. You could put it in an anchor or a paragraph, whatever. I'm just choosing a span because it's the easiest and least obtrusive. Okay, so I now have a span inside my button. And let's pick a new utility class for this. Let's call it anim button, animated button. And all anim button should need is a transition property. Actually, we don't even need the transition property, not for what we're going to do. I'm going to leave it empty. But anim button on hover is going to receive an animation property. And that animation property, this is a shorthand for a number of animation properties, so if you're really into it, I'd say investigate the longhand and you should be able to figure out quite a bit more. But first comes the name of our animation. I'm going to call it text wiggle. Then the duration of our animation. Let's do half a second. Then the easing of our animation. I'm just going to keep it simple with linear. And then the direction, and then whether or not we want to repeat our animation, and I'm going to do infinite. Text wiggle, 0.5 seconds, linear, infinite. Now all we need to do is define what text wiggle means. And to do this, we're going to use CSS keyframes. So keyframe animation, you write it with @keyframes, just like a media query. then the name of the animation, text wiggle, and the bare minimum for a CSS keyframe animation is going to require something like 100%. Most animations you will see 0% and 100%, and these percentages are indicative of the progress of the animation timeline. So 0 would be the starting point, 100% would be the ending point. Right now, we've set our animation to be 5 seconds long for animated button, which means at the 0-second timeline, whatever I write in here is going to be in effect. At 0.5 seconds, whatever I write in here is going to be in effect. If our animation were said to be 4 seconds long, this would be at the 4-second marker. So, what do I want to have happen? First of all, I actually want to apply this animation to the span inside my button. So I need to change my selector accordingly. And what I want to do is at 50% through the animation, I want to transform, rotate. Let's try 10 degrees. And let's see, I need to map this out. So it's going to wiggle one way and then wiggle back and then settle back in its original position. So let me change these percentages. Let's try 25%, 50%. We'll go back the other way. Minus 10 degrees. 75%. It will have 0 rotation, so that'll be when it's paused. And it will maintain that until the animation finishes. All right, so let's see. Nope, not working. Oh, I didn't give the class of animated button to this button. Let's see what's going on. So the animation is applied. It is working. I wonder if it's because it's a span. Yeah, it's just because it's a span. All right, so the animation looks terrible, but we can fix that. Let me make sure that span is set to block. Inline elements will not respond to the transform property. Not like that. I'm going to put on easing. Well, at least you get the idea. When I hover over the button, now the text wiggles. As soon as I pull my mouse away, it will stop. We can tweak the percentages in our keyframes here to make it feel a little bit more organic. We can certainly change the timeline so that that's a little better, actually. All we needed to do was slow it down. And the text will wiggle back and forth. Let's also have the background color of this button change as we hover over it. And I'm going to use another separate keyframe for this. So now when I hover over the button itself, it's going to have an animation of Background change, 1 second, ease in, out, infinite. Copy this, paste. This is going to be background change, and rather than transform, we're going to use background color. Let's just see, purple. Alright, so now, when I hover over the button, it's going to give somebody a seizure. Let's change the timeline on that as well to 3 seconds. And we've got a very psychedelic button. Only thing I don't like is that it kind of clips between the ending red color and the original color's my button, tomato color. So to do that, I'm going to add to the background change animation alternate, which will cause it to reverse the animation. It's going to hit the end and then reverse rather than clip. It'll go from 0 to 100%, from 100% to 0%, and then back and forth again and again. Yeah, it's a disco party on hover. And again, to achieve this, all I need to do is add the class of AnimButton to a button. It's a good point, Adrian. They're fluid without having a transition because the entire timeline of the animation is manually taken care of by this keyframe animation. Keyframes do not require a transition. They inherently imply one from 0 to 100 and give you the option to map them out manually however you'd like. And you can change as many or as few properties throughout an animation timeline as you'd like, again, without a transition property. So if you get very into keyframe animations, you can do some very cool stuff. In fact, why don't we try a useful and much more useful than this, a useful and much more approachable keyframe animation on a Bootstrap navbar. I said this session was not going to be about any JavaScript, but it can be about a little Bootstrap. So I'm going to quickly hook Bootstrap up to my template here. And I'm only going to hook up the CSS part because we're not going to need the JavaScript at all. I don't need my navbar to collapse or anything like that. Navbar. Here, I'm going to go with this one. It's nice and simple. Paste that code right in my body. Make sure it's all indented the way that I'd like. It's actually, forget it, I'll leave it. Load, and we have our navbar. Now it doesn't expand, but I'm going to get rid of this navbar expand LG class, and it should actually, correction, I'm going to get rid of the LG at the end of the navbar expand class, and it will never be collapsed. And then I'm going to change BG light to BG info. Now I'm going to get rid of it entirely. Change it to navbar dark. And let's give our nav a background color of tomato. Alright, so there we are. This is our navbar. Now a common element of very nice looking sites or professional sites is the navbar itself will undergo some kind of change. when a user interacts with the site. Either they start to scroll and all of a sudden the nav bar like fills out, or it fades, or the background color changes, or it gets smaller to allow you to consume more of the content of the site. It's a really common touch, and most people think that it can only be done with JavaScript. I'd argue that it's best done with JavaScript, but it can be done with CSS. It certainly can be. There's nothing stopping you. So if I wanted to do that, I might simply apply to my nav an animation. But first, let me think about what do I want to have happen. I'm going to make sure background color and color are both covered in my CSS, not Bootstrap. Oops. You know what? I'm just going to save time here. Damn. Okay. So what do I want to have happen? Let's say I want, after a couple seconds on this site, I want the nav bar to get thinner. I want the background color to fade out, so it's about 50% opaque. And I want the font sizes to change. All of these things I want to happen organically after a couple of seconds on my page. So first, let's see, can I change the font size of my anchors? 12 pixels, that looks good. Can I change the padding on my nav? Not like that. So where's it coming from? It's coming from Bootstrap. And it's coming from the element with the class of navbar. So that'll do it. Well, hang on. I'll keep that horizontal padding. Maybe even push it further in. Alright, so this and this are things I want to have happen on animation, and I want the background color to change. Let's see what that new background color needs to be. I'm going to use my color picker. I'm going to drag down the opacity to this. Okay, and I'm going to get rid of that disabled link. Alright, so this is what I want my navbar to transition to after a few seconds on my site. So there's two places where I need these kinds of things to happen. I can do this with two different animations, pretty simply. So let's do nav change. Let's try 5 seconds. Ease in, out, and forwards. Forwards will actually maintain the last frame of the animation. And then let's add the same thing to our anchors. Call it anchor change. Now, for the nav, the thing that I want to change is the background color. I want it to go from tomato to this. So you might think that I want to start with background color tomato at 0%, and that would make sense. But I don't want a user to see the animation just yet. I don't want the change to happen at all for like 3 seconds. So I want 3 seconds, nothing happens, and then in 2 seconds, the change occurs. So what I'd recommend is figure out what percentage of 5 seconds is 3 seconds, and that's 60%. So from 0% background color tomato to 60% still background color tomato, then we have our change. Let's do the same for anchor change. And what do I want to change? I want the font size to go from whatever it is initially to 12 pixels. And that's it. That's fine. Same timing, same everything. All right, let's see. And our nav bar transitioned. You guys catch that? One more time. Reload my page, wait 3 seconds, and transition. This isn't the most effective user experience here as far as nav bars are concerned. It's very difficult to see, in fact, but hopefully you get the idea of how you can actually cause your nav bar to appear as though it's evolving with user interaction with the site. After 3 seconds, a user has probably started scrolling down, and then they see your nav bar suddenly shift into this whole new layout, whole new arrangement. It gives a sense of interactivity and professionalism to your site far beyond just a static fixed nav bar. Does that make sense? It's the kind of thing that would more traditionally be done in JavaScript, but I don't want all the JavaScript monkeys out there to tell me that it's not possible without JavaScript. It definitely is. It definitely is. There's only 10 minutes left. If nobody has any other questions, I will say there's one other way you could achieve that kind of delayed effect, and that's with a property called animation delay. But I actually prefer not to use it and code the delays into my keyframes like this. It's up to you. All right. What's some other cool CSS stuff that isn't too crazy? I'm sorry we couldn't go over Flexbox Farida. That's kind of a big subject. How many seconds long? As many as you'd like, honestly. I mean, there's no limit that I can think of. You could have a 1-minute animation. You could have a 5-second animation that repeats forever. It's up to you. All right, how about a little more box shadow? Div with idea box. Actually, before I get into a little more box shadow stuff, while we still have the time, common question that I get is how to perfectly center something on your page or inside another element. It's a great question because we know how to center a div, right, with margin auto or margin 0 auto, but how do you vertically center it? How do you vertically center it? That's a great question. Well, our div right now is contained inside our body. But even if it weren't, what you could do is give the body element, the parent element, that is, position relative, the div itself, position absolute. Let's see where that puts it. Predictably right there. And then something like top 50%, so 50% from the top of its parent. Left 50%, 50% from the left of its parent. But what that's actually going to do... Oh, my body's really small right now because it doesn't have anything in it. So I'm going to make it as tall as the window real quick. Okay. What that actually does is it puts the top left corner of the div right in the center. And that's great and all, but that's not what we want. It gets us close, though. To finish it off, we're going to add that transform property back in. And we're going to slide it left minus 50%. And that's 50% of the element's own width here. And then slide it up minus 50%. 50% of its own height. So it's right in the middle of its parent, the top left corner, but it's going to slide 50% of its own width left and 50% of its own height up, and is perfectly centered. Now, box shadow, what I was going to talk about, we can use any kind of dimensions inside box shadow that we'd like. So let's say I want it to be minus 100% on the x-axis, minus 100% on the y-axis. I want 0 blur, and I'll just make it black. Too far, right? But we know the height and width of this box. It's actually off the page now. So I messed up. Let's make this minus 150 pixels and minus 150 pixels. And we actually have an identical replica of our box. Now let's add another one, because we can add as many of these box shadows as we'd like inside the same property with a comma. Change it to positive 150 and minus 150. Now let's add 2 more. Make a chessboard, checkerboard, whatever. Minus and plus, plus and plus. 5 boxes from 1, all using box shadow. Or 5 circles. All right, that's all I got for you guys. It's now 5:56. Yeah, Tony, it's a good observation. Flexbox exists specifically for vertically centering with justify content and align item center and all that jazz. And it's how Bootstrap actually powers a lot of what it does. But this method will serve you well regardless of the use case. Flexbox is considerably bigger than that. Flexbox does nothing that we can't do with vanilla CSS. It just makes certain things easier. So it's a great tool, but if you're really getting that finicky with your styles, that you're using transform a lot or all of these techniques, then you should know what's really happening behind the scenes and how Flexbox is really doing what it's doing. All right, that's all I got for you guys. I hope this was helpful. And I'll see you again next week.